The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Good afternoon and welcome back to day 4 of KCIS after a short break, very short. We have the pleasure this afternoon of the Commandant of the NATO Defense College, Lieutenant General Rittimann, addressing us. The Commandant will be introduced by Brigadier General Mark Campbell, and the Q&A session will be moderated by Colonel Todd Strickland. General Mark Campbell joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 1981 as a private with the 4th Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment. He accepted his commission to officer 6 years later, and would go on to command that same battalion between 2002 and 2005. He has served with the Canadian Land Forces Command and Staff College as directing staff, and he's commanded at the colonel level, 31 Canadian Brigade Group. He's been employed as a Land Forces Central Area Headquarters at the Land Forces Central Area Headquarters in Toronto, and as the Associate Director of the Canadian Army Land Warfare Centre. He's promoted to his current rank in 2019 and assigned as Deputy Commander of 4th Canadian Division. Most recently and currently, he is the Deputy Commander of Reserves, Canadian Army Doctrine Center in Kingston. Sir, it's my pleasure to hand the floor over.
Great, thank you, Trevor. I'm very pleased to introduce our closing keynote speaker for the conference, Lieutenant General Olivier Rittimann, Commandant of the NATO Defense College in Rome. And I must admit, I was fascinated by General Rittimann's biography. After graduating from the Military Academy of St. Cyr and the Army Engineer School, General Rittimann chose a career with the Foreign Legion, serving in the 4th and 6th Foreign Legion regiments as a platoon and company commander. He deployed on operations in Chad, Mayotte, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. Following a subsequent period of military education, which included the U.S. Army General Staff College at Leavenworth, the Armed Forces Staff College at Norfolk, and the Joint Defense College in Paris, he returned to the 6th Foreign Legion Engineer Regiment. After another operational tour in Bosnia-Herzegovina with S4 and time at Allied Forces North Headquarters in the Netherlands, he returned to then command the 1st Foreign Legion Engineer Regiment. Following his command, General Rittimann spent time in Pakistan, first at the National Defense College, then as the Defense Attaché. He was promoted to Brigadier General in 2010, served at Allied Force Command Heidelberg, and deployed to ISAF as Chief of Operations. As a Major General, he was the French National Military Representative to NATO's Allied Command Operations and helped define the French force package for the enhanced forward presence in the Baltics. Following his promotion to Lieutenant General, he served as Chief of Staff at Joint Forces Command Brunsum, Vice Chief of Staff, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, and highly relevant to our conference theme, the Allied Command Operation COVID-19 Task Force Commander. Lieutenant General Rittimann has been Commandant at the NATO Defense College since July 2020, and we are very honored and privileged to have him as our speaker this afternoon. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much for these kind introducing words, which remind me that I'm getting older because the longer the biography, the longer you've been under the harness. But thanks a lot. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to provide the keynote speech of this highly interesting conference. But first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Queen's University and the Kingston Consortium on International Security, for having organized this event and for inviting me to deliver the keynote address. I also want to commend the excellent cooperation between Queen's University and the NATO Defense College. However, it's not as the Commandant of the NATO Defense College that I will deliver these remarks, but as the former head of the NATO COVID Task Force, a mission assigned to me in my former capacity as Vice Chief of Staff in SHAPE. I will share with you what I saw from my observation point as Task Force Commander, but also some thoughts about resilience that came to mind because of that crisis. So let me bring back to spring 2020 and even a little bit earlier than that. At the height of the COVID crisis, a number of voices criticized NATO's absence in the fight against the pandemic. So as expected, many of these critics came from Russia and China, exploiting a highly effective strategic communication to allege an apparent lack of NATO involvement. However, criticism came also from within the alliance, urging that NATO should wake up to the situation, and Russian propaganda, backed by the actual deployment of planes and trucks to Italy, for instance, and the domestic condemnation fueled a sense of discontent in people as regards the usefulness and effectiveness of international organizations at large, and more specifically, NATO and the European Union. This impression of inaction persisted for a couple of weeks after the outbreak of the COVID crisis, until eventually an aggressive counter-messaging strategy was implemented, put forward by NATO headquarters, SHAPE, and the individual nations themselves. Nevertheless, beside this STRATCOM battle, NATO actually responded very early on the crisis as the crisis was developing. First, by making sure the health emergency did not turn into a security crisis, by giving the false impression that our forces were distracted, which could have led to an escalation of tension with Russia, but also by making available to allied nations all of NATO's coordination mechanism, staff skilled in crisis response and logistics, planning capability, the existing permanent headquarters structure. Some nations took advantage of these resources, others preferred to operate at the national level, at least initially. But the fact remains that NATO, and most particularly Allied Command operations, was ready and remained in a position of readiness throughout the crisis, thereby underscoring the relevance of the organization. To properly understand NATO's actions and their limits during the COVID crisis, one must understand the general context in which NATO was operating at the time of the outbreak in spring of 2020. After years of engaging in expeditionary warfare, NATO had to refocus on what was required for collective defense, after having suffered a very rude awakening after the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the subsequent war in eastern Ukraine. Back in 2019, NATO was in the process of formulating a new military strategy and subsequently a new concept for the deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic era, and a look into the future, how warfighting might evolve. The focus was naturally placed on the military side of the spectrum, because no one truly believed that fighting a pandemic was a responsibility for NATO, even though time and again lip service was paid to the idea. Piecemeal mechanisms had been put in place since the invasion of Crimea, such as the Readiness Action Plan, the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, for instance. However, one disturbing factor after Crimea was that the alliance was less ready than it thought it was. It appeared that crossing borders in peacetime with military hardware was proving much more difficult than anticipated. Therefore, much effort was put into improving the mobility of NATO forces, their availability, and their ability to be deployed at the speed of relevance. A series of real-time exercises and trials was implemented to assess the difficulties involved in moving a rapid reaction force across Europe by land and by air. And under this framework, allies created a mechanism for rapid air mobility, which would attribute a unique NATO call sign to military flight as a way of facilitating the handling of air traffic control, diplomatic clearances, and to remove route restrictions. All this in close cooperation with the pan-European organization Eurocontrol. However, prior to the outbreak of the COVID crisis, such a mechanism had never been used. The onset of the health crisis in China did not go unnoticed. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, so known as SHAPE, horizon scanning by the Operations Center alerted the command group to a potential spillover. This triggered the business continuity plan that was originally designed to ensure continuity of command in case of a conventional attack, a terrorist attack, a cyber, or even a nuclear attack. SHAPE quickly adapted this BCP to the situation by importing the rules and the best practices of the World Health Organization. So implementing reduced manpower, shift work, teleworking, and reducing travel. In early March, orders for force protection were issued to the subordinate commands to continue delivering effective and credible deterrence and defense, which is NATO's core mission. And as stated by the Secretary General, the health crisis would not turn into a security crisis by giving the impression that NATO was lowering its guard. Concurrently, a major live exercise was cancelled to reduce the movement of troops across Europe, thus avoiding to become another vector of the virus. Once its own house was put in order, the question arose as to how best use the military instrument of power to tackle the health crisis, and specifically, how NATO could play a role alongside the allied nations. So within the inventory of NATO-owned assets, several items were considered. The NATO command structure and its permanent headquarters, with staff trained in crisis response and procedures, that was undeniably the most valuable asset that we had. We had also NATO civilian agencies who could play a role, in particular the NATO Support and Procurement Agency located in Luxembourg. This agency deals with contracting and equipment purchasing on a daily basis, and it benefited already from the right connections to the commercial world. And at NATO headquarters in Brussels, we have also the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Coordination Center, which was activated at the onset of the crisis and served as the hub to match the requests with offers coming from the nations. As a result, action did start early, but was not visible. NATO does not own any transport assets, such as planes, trucks, or ships, or even field hospitals. Whenever these assets are supplied to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, so the boss of NATO operations, for a given operation, they follow a procedure of transfer of authority and remain under his command until the nations decide to pull them back. So the bottom line is that SACEUR doesn't own anything. It controls and commands only what the nations are prepared to give to him. Nothing is permanent. Everything is transferred for a given period of time, apart from the NATO command structure. As the crisis worsened, individual allies, understandably so, reacted first at the national level to deal with their own national emergency. And NATO wanted to help, but in no way interfere in these efforts. The rapid air mechanism, mobility mechanism, which I referred to earlier on, was activated and offered to the nations to facilitate the movement of medical supplies. Some used it, some did not. Several multinational initiatives regarding strategic airlift existed also, such as the Strategic Airlift International Solution, using contracted Antonov airframes, or the Strategic Airlift Capability based in Hungary and using C-17 airframes, sharing the cost of the flight hours. However, none of this solution belongs to NATO or is controlled by SACEUR. Hence, SACEUR, in his NATO capacity, could not rely on strategic airlift, even though as chief of the US European Command, he directed numerous American relief flights. In addition to the lack of its own strategic transport, NATO did not have any stockpiles of the required medical equipment, which it could have distributed to the nations in need. There was no prior plan in place for this, and obviously was a worldwide shortage of masks, respirators, and protective equipment. There was no time, nor the material possibility to create a stockpile from scratch. The procurement agency strove to buy as much equipment as it could, and some nations ended up grouping their order through the agency in order to avoid commercial fratricide. But all in all, the general picture, as understood by public opinion, was that of disjointed efforts, competition to access medical supplies, and powerlessness of international organization, thereby casting doubt as to their usefulness. And NATO was not spared. The generalized lack of confidence was made worse by hostile propaganda from Russia, which ruthlessly exploited the health crisis in an aggressive strategic communication campaign. At NATO headquarters, there was a sense of urgency that this campaign needed to be countered in order to protect NATO's relevance. So the public diplomacy division in the headquarters and other communications directorates across the alliance began coordinating the response to the Russian and Chinese propaganda. The messaging was illustrated by pictures of NATO's concrete actions, thus demonstrating to the world that the organization was not sitting idle, even if dealing with a pandemic was not NATO's core business. Particular emphasis was put on the fact that NATO's core mission is to protect the lives of over 1 billion people by deterring any aggression and, if need be, defending the alliance territory. This state of permanent vigilance helped the national authorities to deal with their own health crisis without having to worry about the overall security of the alliance. No opponent could seize the opportunity to gain some advantage, and that message was quite clearly supported by the nations. What was not so unanimously shared was the media exploitation of individual allies' efforts. The messaging from NATO HQ stressed that any support provided by individual NATO armed forces in their own country should be considered as a NATO activity. And therefore, there was a lot of pressure put on nations to provide figures, footage, and pictures of their troops supporting the government-wide relief operations. Initially, some nations judged these to be national or bilateral actions not decided or executed by NATO as an organization. Some countries did not understand the real need to counter the hostile propaganda with concrete examples, or were so deeply involved in their own national handling of the crisis that they simply did not take the time. By the 2nd of April 2020, the Allied Foreign Affairs Ministers directed SHAPE to officially stand up a COVID-19 task force to coordinate the action of the Allies, which was the official acknowledgement that NATO had played a role and must continue to do so in the future. But as supplies started coming in massive quantities, nations had better picture of available resources, and SHAPE could understand where shortfalls still remained and direct excess resources towards them. And allied nations actually turned eventually to the task force to deconflict and reallocate resources for the following month. Gradually, until the summer, the task force was operating, and it started to be phased down as the first COVID crisis really went away. NATO as an organization and from an allied military viewpoint coped as best as they could with the first COVID wave, as nations did also. Many lessons were identified, which are now incorporated in the operational plans. And the purpose of the plans is to provide SHAPE with a bird's eye view of all available resources in each ally across the area of responsibility. Monitoring the evolution of the crisis would help determine the point of need at a given time, showing SACEUR where to shift his effort for that period. This would ensure an efficient use of available resources, reorienting surplus and spare capacities, and also guaranteeing to the nations that this effort would shift as the crisis evolves. In addition to the plan, nations agreed to create a NATO stockpile of medical equipment, which would serve in an emergency, enabling the first peak of a potential crisis to be absorbed. Beyond the specific plan to counter the COVID-19, SHAPE planners are producing a more extensive counter-pandemic plan, not solely focusing on the current emergency, but considering any such threat as might materialize in the future. Indeed, this crisis has demonstrated that the alliance needs to be ready in unexpected domains. Alongside the traditional ones, NATO recently declared cyber and space as new domains of warfare. Pandemic may also become another area of concern for the alliance and its members. Many existing structures or mechanisms will have to be adapted to better cope with the emergence of new types of threats. Civil emergency plans, for instance, focused more on managing the situation at the rear and responding to the needs of the civilian population to make sure this did not obstruct military operations on the front line. This is still true today, even if the notion of frontline has become less relevant given the range of new weapons or cyber attacks. But the real way forward lies in fostering fast-track cooperation between allies to pool their resources and better respond to a crisis. Now some thoughts about resilience. There is a lot of talk about the origin of the COVID-19 virus. Was it natural? Was it engineered? If so, was it an accident? Was it deliberate? We will probably never know the answer to this answer. to this question, but just for the sake of imagining a scenario, let us try and do some strategic fiction. And I stress that this is only fiction. What if the COVID-19 was a test bed for a future attack? What if it had been released to analyze our reactions, to put stress on our system in order to see where the gaps exist, where the weak points can be targeted? Again, nothing tells us this was the case, but let us just unleash our imagination for a while. For a potential aggressor who would have in mind to weaken the alliance, or for that matter, even the European Union, what would be the lessons he would have learned from the COVID-19 crisis handling? He would have discovered a surprisingly fragile medical and healthcare system throughout all our countries, a system that was barely able to absorb the casualties at the price of a total lockdown for several months, which inflicted and still inflicts enormous damage to the economies, but also to the societies of our democratic nations. He would have seen an alliance in a European Union which no longer control essential segments of industrial production, which have outsourced any kind of supplies, ranging from medicine to spare parts, from face masks to electronic components, where emergency stocks are not maintained because the development of worldwide logistics no longer justified it, without even mentioning the heavy reliance of energy supplies coming also from abroad. He would also have seen an exposed center of gravity. Indeed, the tensions due to the initial lack of medical supplies harmed the solidarity between allies, what is considered as its center of gravity. As all individual allies strove to deal first with the crisis in country, even if it meant competing fiercely for these limited resources. This opponent might therefore conclude that the center of gravity might not be as protected as it should be. The West might still possess military superiority granted by cutting-edge technology, at least for a while. But if the social tissue of its countries can be damaged at such minimal cost, what use is this technology? And by minimal cost, I do not refer to the heavy toll paid by each and every one of our countries in matters of life lost. I'm referring to the minimal cost a potential aggressor would have had to pay to launch such an attack. Indeed, this potential aggressor would also have seen that he could get away with such an attack, should he wish to perform it. A pandemic spread is hardly attributable. It does not involve tanks crossing borders or planes violating sovereign airspace or missiles destroying urban centers. It is even more insidious than a cyber attack, which eventually specialists are able to narrow down to a specific actor. Here we imagine a virus that would be deliberately put in circulation, what we used to fear during the Cold War when we spoke about bacteriological attacks. But there is a difference to that period when we knew that a bacteriological attack would necessarily come from the Soviet Union if it was launched. Here, this new potential aggressor might accept to take himself casualties in a significant way. Who would then think that this was done on purpose? Certainly not our democracies, which cannot envision such a ruthless and cynical scenario. But what about a totalitarian regime, strictly controlling its population and willing to sacrifice some of its own citizens to blur the landscape? Would that be a workable assumption? If so, what would we need to do to counter that sort of attack? Made all the more complex if it went au pair with a cyber attack. What concrete actions should NATO and the EU take to avoid being cornered like in 2020, but in a much bigger and dangerous way? I suggested that we might look at it from a potential aggressor's perspective, but indeed what I meant is that we have actually some tough lessons identified to address. First and foremost, our countries must control all the means that will allow them to treat the symptoms of the attack, to deal with the virus. We need to regain control of the production of protective equipment, such as suits, masks, respirators, oxygen bottles, pills, all these items which have been outsourced over the last 20 years to remote areas on the other side of the planet. This created huge waiting lists and delays and put the producer in a position of strength, which is not acceptable. When manufacturing is out of one's control, it is not possible to decide when to increase production and who gets the priority. And arguably, medical supplies proved to be at least as strategic as some of the items in our defense arsenals, if not more so. Manufacturing facilities dealing with these strategic assets must therefore be repatriated. In parallel, the medical structure of our countries need to be reinforced so as to be able to absorb the initial shock, which will anyway come as a surprise. But once the initial blunt has been coped with, the structures need to be resilient enough to cope with the crisis in the long run, with infrastructure able to treat the patients in great numbers, but also a pharmaceutical industry geared to produce treatments in a quick way, without having to rely on imports from outside the area. And by the way, this is also true in the case of a conventional crisis. This resilience needs also to become a reality in our societies. Could we afford to face every year a similar crisis that destroys the social fabric of our countries? Because it does not even take one massive bacteriological attack to defeat us. A succession of limited scale pandemics like the ones we are witnessing would be enough to put us on our knees. So how do we make sure that our societies can continue to function even under stress? Which means keeping schools and universities open, keeping businesses running, ensuring the industrial base of our country is still producing, transports are still operating, all our citizens are supplied in a regular way, social interaction is still possible, and individual freedom is preserved. This seems to be the challenge our governments will have to face for the coming decades, on top of terrorism and the always possible conventional crisis. As a military organization structured and trained to provide crisis response under pressure, NATO can deal with the latter by ensuring deterrence and defense remain effective and that the non-attributable crisis does not turn into a real open security crisis. But for the rest, it will take a synchronized, coordinated and shared effort by all nations belonging to NATO and the EU to draw the lessons and take hard decisions so as not to be caught off guard next time. Thank you for your attention, and I am ready to answer your questions.
Sir, thank you very much for that presentation. A lot to chew on, and being that I've been asked to moderate the discussion, I'm going to start with the first question because you raised it as the center of gravity for NATO's response. And I'm just wondering if at your level, if you assigned a center of gravity or determined a center of gravity within your task force and what it was and why you chose it.
Generally speaking, when you talk about NATO, the center of gravity is really the solidarity between the allies. I mean, this is at the core of the Washington Treaty, and it's completely embodied by the Article 5 itself. If one gets attacked, all the rest must respond. So we identify the center of gravity definitely as the solidarity between the different NATO allies. And what we witnessed on the TV was not precisely building that way. When you looked at some of the hard fights over Chinese planes full of masks, it was not the best picture you could give about solidarity. So this was definitely one of the centers of gravities that we identified in the task force. And this is also why we wanted to have a shape in a position to be able to redirect excess supplies, because we knew that some countries had too much of it and some countries didn't have enough. So we knew that we could actually at least have an impartial view and try to convince the nations to do it. It took a while because obviously the nations were focusing on their internal problems, but then after a while, when they realized that we could help and that it was actually in the best interest of everybody to share the excess surplus, it worked.
Thanks for that, sir. A follow-on question related to the NATO's response. Some of the requests to NATO for COVID-19 assistance came from partners where operations are or were taking place, such as Afghanistan, Iraq, or Kosovo. Were there any unique challenges in terms of NATO's ability to respond to these requests, or more broadly, adapting mission tasks to the realities caused by the pandemic?
As I said in my speech, NATO doesn't own any assets, and definitely all the kind of assets that were required during the first wave of the COVID, we didn't have. What we did actually regarding the force protection of the troops deployed in this operation area was to apply the same measures that we had applied throughout our headquarters, limiting the social interaction, trying to remove the people as much as possible from crowded areas, and that kind of measures. But we were not in a position to provide what was needed. To give you an example, at that time, I was also the operation commander for Althea as the vice consul in shape. So I was dealing with Bosnia. Bosnia was in very dire conditions at that time. And actually, even my forces deployed on the ground were facing the same challenges, and we didn't have anything to provide them, but council's advice and best practices so as to avoid the spread and try isolating the people who were actually turning positive. That was the best we could do at that time, just giving orders for force protection.
Understood, sir. Are you able to discuss how you deconflicted the operational space between yourself as the NATO task force and EU? I would imagine, and the EU writ large. I would imagine there was a fair amount of overlap between the two entities within the European space in particular.
By operational space, you mean during the COVID crisis? Who was answering to what?
Yes, sir, exactly.
Yeah, actually, the people who did the deconfliction were sitting in NATO headquarters, and that was the what I refer to as the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Control Center. We in SHAPE, we send them quite a lot of our people specialized in CIMIC, Civil Military Interaction, the GN9, the J9 people, and the European Union also. So this was serving as the hub of all the requests that would have to be processed. So you had nations asking for resources, other nations proposing excess resources, and this was actually coordinated through the EDRIC, what we call the EDRIC, the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Center, in close coordination with the European Union. But the European Union doesn't have what NATO has. We have a complete network of permanent headquarters throughout the area. So we have actually points of contact everywhere, which is not the case on the military side, I mean, for the European Union. The European Union had other points of contact, which proved to be very effective because the combination of both organizations actually covered the full spectrum of what was required.
Thank you, sir. The last question I have at this time, and we'll just see if there's anyone else who's going to add to our question bank. You brought up the disaster response organization, and you also raised the idea that NATO made good use of civilian agencies, such as contracting and purchasing, to deal with things that were uniquely possible for civilians to get after, if I can use that term. And when we try and balance the NATO mission of deterrence and defense versus the emergent mission of crisis response, I'm just wondering if in your lessons learned, if you've determined that there's more of a need for civilian agencies within the NATO or alliance construct that can specifically look after tasks related more to crisis response as opposed to the deterrence mission, and alleviate some of the pressure on standing military forces to do a role they were never intended for.
Yeah, the agency I mentioned in my speech is actually a NATO agency. It is civilian because it's not composed of military, but it belongs to NATO. It's the NATO Support and Procurement Agency, and this is an agency that is dealing permanently on a daily basis with purchasing equipment for the various NATO allies, spare parts, dormant contracts, supply contracts. So they are used to do that, but they belong to NATO. It's not a civilian contractor. They are in touch with civilian contractors and they can make things happen, yes. So this structure exists in peacetime, and it would be also completely used in time of crisis. They own the deployable assets for their headquarters. They support quite a lot of the troops in the NS4 presence. I mean, the action of the NSPA is something that is daily in NATO. So we could rely on them because they had already all the network connections with the commercial world. So it was not a burden for our logisticians, it was really their job.
Roger, sir, and understood. the point I was trying to get at was whether NATO needs additional civilian elements in its organization to handle these types of events in the future. Could we envision civilian hospitals as an example, and civilian transport organizations that could be used to respond to crises? But I think you've more than answered the question. So, sir, unless you've got anything to add or any closing comments, thank you very much for your time this morning. Or I guess it's this evening in Europe. Thank you again, and I'll return it to the moderators for the conclusion of the conference. Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you, Lieutenant General Rittimann, Todd. We will now move to Dr. Carol Evans for closing remarks. By way of introduction, Dr. Evans is the director of the Strategic Studies Institute at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She served as the advisor to the Director of Central Intelligence. She's been a technical advisor to the National Ground Intelligence Center and an advisor to the National Defense Science Board. She has operational experience with the U.S. Navy 3rd Fleet, and has held a myriad of faculty and research positions in American educational institutions. Dr. Evans comes to us eminently qualified to wrap up the conference. So Dr. Evans, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Tardy. And again, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I know many of us would have much preferred to have conducted this year's Kingston conference on the military's role in the pandemic and future crises in person. And it's always been a pleasure. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to go to the conference and actually present a paper instead at Queen's University, and really enjoying the picturesque location in Ontario. Nonetheless, I think the last 4 days of this virtual conference have been extremely enlightening. I certainly have taken away quite a number of notes, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing the final conference papers. As director of SSI and a longtime partner in the Kingston Consortium on International Security, I really want to take this time to, with my closing remarks, to extend my thanks to the entire Kingston team. In particular, Dr. Stephanie von Acti and Ms. Maureen Bantram, and along with SSI's own Trey Brown. Together, they've been really vital and instrumental in developing the conference over the past sort of 9 months. You know, dialogues, a lot of virtual meetings, and helping to structure a really tight conceptual framework, which I think has been proven a very strong component of this year's conference. And also, of course, in bringing all of you, the most engaging speakers that we've enjoyed over these past several days. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend yesterday's session because I had some prior scheduling conflicts, which included briefing all of the some of the senior Army leadership that came out for a half day from the Pentagon here at the U.S. Army War College. And in my session, I was actually speaking about how we support Army research from a strategic, geostrategic, national security level. But in my group of attendants, I had the Surgeon General and Commanding General, U.S. Army Medical Command. I had Chief of the Army Reserve, and I had the Deputy Director for our G357 Army staff. And as I was relaying that I was having to juggle these different commitments, and that in fact, as I was speaking to them, SSI was co-hosting the Kingston conference, and this year's topic was indeed on the role of the military in the pandemic. And they immediately pounced on this topic, and what was supposed to have been a very short introduction for me and highlights sort of sidelined a lot of the discussion because they're very, very animated and very interested in learning, well, what were the lessons learned? From what countries were participating and what kinds of experiences did they find? Very curious about the role, of course, of NATO and what kinds of parallel experiences were happening across our different allies and partners. And immediately was, when can we see an interim report, or when can we see the final report? So it was perfect timing on my part to be able to say, hot off the press, here was something so topical and so relevant some of my senior Army leadership yesterday. And as I listened to day 1 and day 2, and now day 4, I'm also struck by some common themes and experiences, including the impact of internal domestic demands on militaries to support the pandemic response. And some key themes we heard repeated throughout these days were retention, impacts to recruitment, training, and reconstitution. In other words, another important word throughout is resiliency in all caps. We also identified the need to truly implement a whole of government and a whole of nation approach. And this requires better policy and legal frameworks, as well as crisis management tools, some of which, as we saw from, I think, day 1's panel, have gone by the wayside with the end of Cold War and our sort of laser-like focus on the last 2 decades and our global war on terror. And I think there's a sense then of urgency too with looking at some of our crisis management tools, bringing them out of mothballs, and especially given the unfolding global environment in which we find ourselves. And we heard from, for example, Mr. Nate Freer's paper on the evolving threat environment in which we find ourselves and how we as militaries need to be anticipating then and responding to this hyper-competitive environment. And we also saw with today's panel too, some key looks at that, again, from a global perspective, how are we anticipating the impact of COVID in different regions and with defense spending on NATO itself. And whether those are things that we then need to sort of backwards integrate in terms of our planning and our response capabilities. You heard from the introduction, I have a strong intelligence background, and of course I was happy to facilitate the panel on information and intelligence sharing mechanisms. And clearly there was a great consensus in terms of that need for those mechanisms, both at the local, state, tribal, and federal levels. Not only there within countries, but also, of course, internationally, multilaterally. We did speak about, for example, the benefits of very important information sharing and intelligence mechanism, namely the 5 Eyes. Yet there's still room, obviously, for improvement. We saw that within information sharing and intelligence, the remarkable capabilities of those agencies to sustain their efforts. And in fact, the need, given some of the impacts of COVID on their capabilities, to in fact increase their coordination efforts. But we also have learned over the past 4 days that there's tremendous need in intelligence and information related to information collection, dissemination, with misinformation, with disinformation, supply chains, and resource management. So tremendous amount of work still to be done as we're not yet through this pandemic. What also struck me this week too are the many strengths that the military, and especially our armies, have brought to the pandemic fight. Adaptability, ingenuity, planning, logistics, commitment, sustainment. We're trusted agents, we're professionals. And we are doing all of that in the face of much uncertainty and a highly politicized environment. So to really conclude this conference, I just want to say again, I'm really excited to read the final publication of the conference papers. And perhaps in future Kingston conference series, we've already heard some suggestions for future topics. And I think the continued evaluation of the military's role in other future domestic emergency crises, I think will be another area to examine. So thank you again to the conference organizers, to the presenters, and to the participants for attending today and this past week. And back to you. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. And that does bring to a close KCIS 2021. I'll take this opportunity to remind our audience that the full consortium conference will be available at kcis.org as of next week. And then on behalf of my director, Dr. Stephanie Von Lackey, I'd like to thank the participants, the panelists, our support team, and the attendees for showing up this year. We will now turn our attention to next year. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, so we can stay ready. Thank you.